Okay, it looks like we are live across all of the various properties. How is everyone doing today? Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Jason Levine, Principal Evangelist for Adobe Creative Cloud, and today, by user request, I'm going to be talking about a topic which I get asked about all the time, and it's something that every video person should or could or might want to be a little bit more familiar with, which is how to set an audio compressor. Very difficult to do if you're not an audio nerd like me, or if you've never really been taught the proper way. And of course, we have lots of presets and things to get you started, but if you can fundamentally understand how to do it manually, then you can apply it to anything, tame dynamic issues that you might be having, assist in actually making your overall mixes more consistent, louder. There's so many benefits to understanding how this works, and that's what we're going to cover today. So as always, a couple of quick shouts into the chat here. Russell Underhill, how are you? Ambreen Hyder, hello. Charles Schulten. Claudia from Romania, great to see you. Carlos, hey, good to see you, man. David, Marcos Luis from Brazil. Another David. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, a lot of different audio things. Been getting asked about them a lot lately, so very excited to bring them to you. All right, David Lewis, how are you? Leonardo Favoretto, great to see you. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get started. All right, hold on. I'm just going to get out of this here. All right, looks good. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to my screen. All right, Sandy Chu, what's up? Philip, Matthew, Max Bard, and Diego. Great to see you all. Okay, so as always, or as of recent, I should say, as of late, we'll reserve questions and stuff for the end. I'm going to take you through this quickly, or, basically thoroughly and as quickly as I can while still being thorough. It's the only way I know how to be. And again, when we're done with this, you should have a really better idea of how to set a compressor manually, and you shouldn't have the fear that you're going to mess something up. Okay, so as I've shown here many times on the stream, the content that we're viewing here is a film called A Scene Between, directed by Brian Rawlis. Got some dialogue. We've got some music, we've got sound effects. Actually, in the overall trailer mix of this final piece, which I'll play a little bit of at the end, got all the elements here. Compression can be used for any number of things, or really almost all things. Most mixes at some point, anything that's on a given track probably goes through a compressor to some degree, just to, again, either even out the dynamics, or in the case of maybe limiting, to really punch things up and just make them a bit more present. Now, the best way to really understand how to set it and really understand and hear what it's doing is to illustrate this on music first. So I happen to have a drum track of some loops in the timeline here, just so that you can actually hear it. That's part of the problem with compression is, especially when you start adding or working with presets just sort of randomly, if you're trying to add like a preset to a voiceover, if you don't know what you're listening for, you might just say, oh, there it is, it's so much louder. Well, yes, there is an amplification element to compression, but that's not really it. I mean, that's one of the things that you can do. Compressors are, in fact, amplifiers as well. But really, what a compressor, specifically compressor, is looking to do, and the reason why you'd use it, is to tame or keep in line dynamics, or the dynamic range, right? So when someone's speaking, as in dialogue, if they get a little bit too loud or get a bit too soft, or they're just kind of all over the place, well, when you throw that into the timeline and add music and sound design and other things there, that vocal's not going to come through. That voiceover is going to be difficult to hear. So if you can even out those peaks that are all over the place, and perhaps at the same time, maybe amplify generally and make everything a little bit louder, or in the case of limiting, just kind of push everything a bit more forward, it's going to make that dialogue a bit more intelligible. It's going to keep the viewer engaged and listening to what's on screen. And it's really easy to do once you kind of understand what to listen for and how to set it, all right? So to illustrate it first, we're going to start with some just basic, this is just a drum track here with no compression. So let me go ahead and just play this for you as it is, just so you can hear what these dry, unaffected, uneq'd, unprocessed drums sound like, all right? Take a quick listen. Okay, so you can hear that, and it sounds probably pretty good, right? And it's nice, and it's punchy, and it's clean, but it can even be better. It can be tighter. And when you talk about compression, specifically to musicians and things, you're always going to hear words like tight and punchy or fat. And the reason for that is, or the opposite of that, which is it sounds too loose, it sounds too flubby, it's wavering. That's because compression is not only used to tame dynamics, right? But at the same time, when applied especially to things like drums, music, bass, whatever, an overall music mix, it's going to give it that extra little, that little punch, right? It's nice to have things very dynamic and very open, and we talked about this the other day on the stream when talking about normalization and compression. In this case, though, what we're wanting to do is, again, just give it a little bit more, all right? And that's really the best way to understand and illustrate what compression sounds like. So let's do that by first adding a compressor to the track here, which is, of course, a non-destructive process. So up here in the track mixer, I'm going to go to my track 2, my groove track, and go to amplitude and compression. Now, this is probably one of the things that, confuses a lot of people, which is that we have inside of here dynamics, which is a compressor, limiter, expander, gate. Dynamics processing, same thing. Hard limiter, which is a digital ceiling and or brick wall limiter. The multiband compressor, which is just that. It's a compressor with a brick wall limiting circuit, a single band compressor, and then the tube modeled compressor. So I always get asked, like, well, which one should I use, right? Well, to illustrate the best way to understand how this works, we're going to go with the tube modeled compressor, because part of understanding what to listen for is also knowing what to look for in terms of the metering, all right? All good compressors will have what's known as a gain reduction meter to show you how much you're actually squishing down the signal or taming or attenuating those ambient peaks, okay, or those transient peaks rather. So tube modeled compressor is a great way to illustrate that, and it also sounds pretty good, and as the name indicates, it is a tube modeled algorithm, an algorithm that's using tube modeled sound design to really emulate those old school compressors, which are warm and fat and really nice. Okay, so let's go ahead and double click on this to go into the edit mode, and it's a very teeny tiny little dialog here. Okay, so let's wind this back so that we're right at the beginning. So in a compressor, and this is all compressors, by the way, you will have 5 basic controls. Now, some different types of compressors, especially classic ones, eliminate some of these because they might do automatic attack and release, for example, or they may have a continuous ratio setting, or they may do an auto gain. But these 5 standard parameters are the standard of how compression works, okay? Threshold, ratio really should be next, output gain, attack and release, okay? So let's start with the threshold, okay? 1. What is the threshold? The threshold is the point at which compression begins. Your signal must exceed, i.e., go over the threshold that you set in order for compression to start happening, okay? So the threshold is the point at which compression begins, all right? Now, in conjunction with the threshold is the ratio setting here. Let me go ahead and zoom in on this for you, all right? And you've probably seen this before, like 3 to 1, 2 to 1, 5 to 1, 10 to 1, etc. Okay, so what is the ratio? Well, the ratio means, if we were, say, using a ratio of 3 to 1, it means that for every 3 dB above the threshold that we set, your signal will be 1 dB at the output. So if you're 3 decibels over the threshold, it's going to squish it down so that it's 1 decibel at the output. If you're 6 decibels above the threshold, 3 to 1, it's going to be 2 decibels at the output. If you're 9 decibels above the threshold, it'll be 3 decibels at the output, right? So for every X dB above the threshold, it's 1 dB at the output, all right? Now that in and of itself takes a moment to wrap your head around, but this is where the metering comes into play. Now, the attack time is how quickly that compressor reacts to those transients, right? Whether it's the or, all the consonant sounds and things that happen when we talk, right? It's that initial bit of sound, how quickly that compressor squeezes down those transients. Now I'm going to show you, and this is why it's great to illustrate with music, You might say, well, wouldn't you want the fastest attack time possible? Well, in some cases, yes. However, when the attack is set to super, super fast, like 0.1 milliseconds, it's compressing all the time. It's squishing everything all the time. And that, especially for dialogue and for drums, as you'll hear in a moment, can really have a not so pleasant kind of sound. Sometimes you want it for effect, but in general, that's not where you want to be. And you have to listen, because if you have the attack set, for instance, with music too quickly, you'll actually end up with these little like clicks or pops. They're not digital clicks or pops. It's that there's more sound that needs to pass through before it squishes that transient down. You'll hear what I mean in just a moment. And then the release time is, once it's compressed that signal down, how long it takes before it recovers back to the original level, right? And 100 milliseconds, these are all the default settings here, by the way. That's kind of a standard amount. Again, that's 1/10 of a second. And for many things, that's pretty good. Now, again, these settings are not absolutes. They will be dependent on who's speaking, who's talking. You know, a really fast-talking radio broadcaster or online commentator or something, they probably need a slightly faster attack and perhaps, maybe in some cases, even a longer release time. Or depending upon what they're doing, if they're sort of very slow and laborious about their speech, in that case, you probably want a very long release time so that it kind of stays compressed while they continue to accentuate different peaks in their speaking, okay? And then the last part is the output gain. And this is when you squeeze something down, right? Remember I told you, 3 to 1. We got 3 decibels above the threshold, it's 1 dB at the output. Well, you're at some point, you're making things a little bit quieter. So you can use the output gain, which is often also known as makeup gain, to add back in the gain that you've squished down, all the while, though, maintaining a very consistent sound. People always ask, well, how much output gain should I use? A good way to set a compressor is, once you know that you're actually exceeding threshold, if you set the output gain to, in other words, if you're bypassing on and off, if you set the output gain to say 2, 3, 4 dB, whatever it needs to be, with the compressor off and the compressor on, the voice or whatever it is should sound about the same relative loudness. If that's the case, you've set the output gain correctly. That means that you're just sort of perfectly compressing without giving any additional boost. If you want to give additional amplitude, that's where you can kick this in, all right? So let's start. So the first thing we need to do is set the threshold on these drums. Now again, I recommend for this, we're going to use, let's use a ratio of around 5 to 1 for these drums. Pretty common for a drum kit. So again, for every 5 dB above the threshold, it's 1 dB at the output. Now this meter here, this is our gain reduction meter. What that means is I need to see this up to 5 decibels on this little meter right here. I need to see at least 5 or 6 lighting up for me to even be compressing, right? I need to be 5 or 6 dB above the threshold. So we got to make sure that we see the red light hit at least right here to know that we're even compressing at all right? Again, this takes a moment to get your head wrapped around. Once you see it, once you start listening for it, you'll get it, all right? So here we go. I'm going to play this back. I'm going to set the threshold accordingly, and you'll start to hear, as I drag the threshold down, how this begins to squash down the peaks. And while I'm at it, we're probably also going to make some adjustments to the attack time here. And I'll show you and let you hear the kind of super fast attack versus a slower attack. All right, let's start with threshold. Here we go. Okay, so right away, I'm going to play this back again. Here it is without compression. Sounds okay, but kind of open. Let's kick the compressor in. Now again, it's quieter because we're squashing it down, right? So we could use a little makeup gain in there to make it the same loudness, the same apparent loudness that it was before we compressed the signal. Now I'm making my threshold a little hotter than I normally would, just so that it's illustrated over the stream. But again, I like that kind of real punchy, thick kind of sound. So let's add back in now a little makeup gain, output gain, so that it's the same whether the compressor is on or off. Here we go. So off, on. Okay, so you see that in this case it took about 4.3 decibels to get us back to about the same level, the same average volume there, but that's perfectly compressed now. Now, let's talk about attack time, okay? Right now you can hear that it's kind of squashing those drums a little much. What that's telling me is that our attack is a little too fast. We need to let more of that crack of the snare, of the kick drum to punch through. We're letting the compressor kick in too soon. Sometimes people like that sound. Depending upon different drummers, different bands, different styles of music, that might work. Let me let you hear what it sounds like at the fastest attack. All right, take a listen to this. Now here it is without. Let's kick it back in. Can you hear that it almost flattens everything out? Now it's lifeless. Now, not only does it not have any dynamics, but because it's compressing the whole time, it just sounds kind of flubby. And in fact, we'd probably need, if we actually wanted to use that for effect, we'd have to increase that release time because we're getting a little bit of what's also known as pumping and breathing as it attempts to recover the compression in between those kick and snare hits. The hi-hat isn't really kicking the compressor in. It's the kick and the snare, right, and the toms. So we probably want to be somewhere between 14 and 20 milliseconds to ensure that that snare crack comes through. This would be the same as a voice. Again, we'll get to this in a moment. Just trying to illustrate how this works to make this sound a bit more natural. Right now, this doesn't sound natural at all. So let's go ahead and wind this back again, play, and I'll start adjusting the attack time. And you're going to hear. Now, again, at around 9 to 11, you might even hear a little bit of a clickiness. That's because it's telling us it's too fast. We need to back off on that attack. Take a listen. Without. Sounds okay. Okay, and it turns out our sweet spot is right around 21 milliseconds. So we're getting enough of that snare to come through. It's squashing down, again, that sort of that transient that's going to cause us to be out of range here. It's going to really exceed everything else in the sound and the scene. And I increase the release time here so that it also stays compressed a bit longer. Right? It was sounding a little too clipped. So in this case, we set the attack to around 21 to let more of that snare come through before it squashes it down. And then I elongated the release so that it stays compressed a little bit longer before it recovers. A lot of times, too, if you've got something like a hi-hat or some other element that's constantly playing that isn't necessarily kicking the compressor in, you adjust that release time so that it sounds more natural, more musical, all right? And again, you can encounter this with Dialog, too, where if you get this weird, it literally sounds like pumping and breathing. You'll hear the compressor kind of, it's going in and out. That means your attack and release are set incorrectly, okay? Or that you have an improper setting of output gain. But attack and release are usually the culprits for bad sounding compression. Okay, so these drums now sound pretty tight, literally. Here's before, right? It just sounds loose, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's not tight. Kick it back in. And it's just, I mean, you feel every hit, every attack. Perfect. Okay. So now let's go ahead and apply this to Dialog, all right? So if we take a listen to the Dialog track here, now just visually looking at this, it's not It's not like extreme. Again, if we're kind of looking at the waveform here, he's got a couple peaks. The average is fairly consistent. So this is telling me that this was well mic'd, done a good job, probably with a boom. But again, it's not very even. So when we played back all of the original content, in fact, here, let me mute. I'm going to mute the groove. Let's play this back as it is, just with everything. Take a quick listen.
Yeah, it's weird. Like I've always struggled with self-doubt. All of these questions about like, are you enough? What are you gonna do with your life?
He's getting a little buried in there, right? Now you might say, well, can't you duck the music more? Yes, we could, but again, he's getting into what I sometimes call the mumbles, which is it's not a slam. But, sometimes people get a little quieter, and then they get a little more excited, and then they get a little quieter. So we want to try and bring out the best elements of the voice while also making it a little more consistent. I like that he gets a little quieter. I like that he has these changes, but we're going to lose some of that if we don't add a little bit of compression. Now, you can also tame some of this with careful equalization, right? That's a different stream. But compression is going to be our friend here. So let's go ahead and solo the dialogue. And same thing, we're going to go up to amplitude and compression, tube modeled compressor. Now, for voiceover, again, this is a fairly, I would say a mid-paced, mid-tempo type speech. He's not doing, he's not going super fast and crazy and, hey, watch this, and we're talking about it. No, he's telling a story in a very natural, human kind of way. So I don't want an extreme ratio here. I don't want to squash it down all that much. So for this type of voiceover, this type of dialogue, I'll usually implement a ratio of about 3 to 1. Maybe even 4 to 1 if there's some crazy peaks. But again, I'm not trying to squash it like those drums. I'm just trying to even things out and then maybe add a little bit of makeup gain in there just to push it forward ever so slightly. So I'm going to start by setting my ratio at 3 to 1. Now, by the way, a little thing on ratio, and I've seen so many tutorials where people have clearly watched some of my tutorials and tried to take the same language and then get a lot of things wrong in the process. So you will probably see or have seen, or maybe you haven't seen, that whenever people talk about compression in the audio world, it's like, oh, we need a compressor limiter. Or, well, actually, no one really says that these days because we have separate effects named differently. But a compressor and a limiter are one and the same. They are the same thing. The difference and what determines whether you are compressing or limiting is the ratio setting. So any ratio below 10 to 1, remember that's for every 10 decibels above threshold, 1 dB at the output. For every ratio below 10 to 1, it's compressing. For every ratio above 10 to 1, it's limiting. All right? Real simple thing to remember. Different sounds. We're not going to cover limiting today. If you want to learn more about limiting, check out my Audio 101 series, episode 9, How to Set a Limiter. Okay, we can cover that on another stream. So again, but for dialogue and things, generally you're probably not going to be using such a high ratio unless there's like real dynamic issues. Different story. This is well recorded, well done. We just want to give this a little bit more presence and push it up a little bit more up front. So we're going to use a ratio of 3 to 1. Now, in terms of attack, again, for this kind of dialogue, probably about 9 milliseconds. That's pretty standard for this kind of voiceover. I just want to catch some of these little peaks that are sneaking through and just squash those down. So I want a fairly fast attack. I don't want it all the way fast. I don't want to be compressing the whole time. I just want to catch those little transients that sneak through so that it's just a bit more even, so that I can push everything forward and it's not going to give me these weird, unnecessary peaks that could ultimately perhaps clip or something like that, right? That's really the key here. Sometimes you want to use vocal compression, to really affect something, again, to use this as an amplifier stage, to really, if this were singing, to really make it aggressive and forward. This is like a documentary here. So I don't want this aggressive and forward. I just want it to be even and pushed forward ever so slightly. If I were mixing this for a trailer, I'd use a higher ratio. But again, being mindful that I don't want this to sound like, deathcore singing. I just want to bring him to the forefront a little bit more. All right. So attack of around 9. Release we'll leave at the default of 100 milliseconds, and we'll leave the output gain for right now to 0. right? We'll make it up after we set the threshold. So let's go ahead and take a listen here. I'm wound back and see what we got and see where we need to be. All right, here we go.
Yeah, it's weird. Like I've always struggled with self-doubt. All these questions about like, are you enough? What are you gonna do with your life? When I am on that seam between society and the wild, it gives me a different perspective that I really value. We need nature to thrive. We yearn for these. We yearn to be tested, and we're all gonna. Yeah, it's weird. Like I've always struggled with self-doubt.
Okay, so here is it with no compression.
All these questions about like, are you enough? What are you gonna do with your life?
Now notice, as I'm turning this on or off now, we're not hearing a great change in amplitude. That's because I'm setting the threshold accordingly so that it's really only catching those peaks that are kind of messing up the overall dynamics of this voiceover, right? So it's not compressing all the time. Only, a couple times he almost leans into his voice and it gets louder over a period of time. That's what we're trying to squish down. That's what we're trying to bring back into range. Now, because of that, I can now use the output gain stage just to, again, push this forward a little bit. So maybe we'll try around 3 dB. All right, let's just wind it back a bit and start playing back. Here we go.
All these questions about like, are you enough? What are you gonna do with your life?
Go even 4.
When I am on that seam
Okay, let's kill it.
between society and the wild, it gives me a different perspective that I really value. We need nature to thrive.
Okay.
We yearn for these. We yearn to be tested, and we're all gonna.
Okay, oh, it's my little, I have it repeating there. Okay, so I think this sounds pretty good. It still sounds natural. It's just evened out now. We've tamed those dynamics. And now if we were to bring everything else back in, you should be able to hear that, or you can hear that he's just going to be sitting on top of this a bit more clearly. Take a listen.
Yeah, it's weird. Like I've always struggled with self-doubt. All these questions about like, are you enough? What are you gonna do with your life?
All right, really easy. And if we wanted to give it even more,
when I am on that seam between society and the wild,
let's kill it.
It gives me a different perspective that I really value.
All right, kind of lose that I value.
We need nature to thrive.
Let's kick it back in.
We yearn for these. We yearn to be tested.
Okay, so you can hear that a little goes a long way. Now I increased this by another 3 dB or so. That's a little hot for my taste. And at this point, this is where I would probably want to duck the music a bit because the music is crescendoing, right? It's getting louder. So this would be a perfect opportunity to use something like Essential Sound, where we have auto ducking, and it will handle the duck of that dialogue for us if we want, or we could just do really a simple little ramp if need be, just to kind of dip down that music ever so carefully. But that's it, friends. Setting a compressor. Again, let's review. Threshold. The point at which compression begins. Your signal must exceed the threshold based on the ratio that you have to even begin compressing. Ratio. For every value above the threshold, it is 1 decibel at the output. So with a ratio of 3 to 1, 3 decibels above threshold, 1 dB at the output. With a ratio of 5 to 1, 5 decibels above threshold, 1 dB at the output. 10 decibels above threshold with a 5 to 1 ratio, 2 decibels at the output. The attack, how quickly the compressor kicks in, right? If it's too fast, it's going to squash everything. Case in point where you might use that. I had to help someone with a podcast recently, and they were doing very sort of radio style. Everybody was on mic, everybody was talking, everybody's laughing. It's chaos. And they're speaking very quickly. Even then, I didn't use a 0 millisecond attack. It was probably around 3, but super fast to make sure that we're just kind of catching everything because there's laughter, there's chaos, there's background noise. It was all over the place. So I used a super fast attack to make sure that it's catching all of those transients, but I used a slightly longer release so that it stayed compressed, so that it stayed at this kind of average squash down level because things were all over the place until they settled back down. And then, again, the compressor will do the work for you at that point, okay? And then your output gain, ideally, if you bypass the compressor and kick it in, your output gain setting should allow you to hear the sound at the same apparent loudness. So if you turn it off and it sounds quiet and you turn it back on and it's still quiet, that means you probably compressed it correctly. If you want to give it a little output gain to make up some of that squeeze down sound, you can do just that. You can use this as an amplifier to really punch that forward, okay? Simple. Threshold, output gain, ratio, attack, release. These really should be, this should be threshold, ratio, attack, release, output gain. That's going to drive me nuts. Now I need to ask the team why it's in that order. That's the wrong order. I love them, but that's the wrong order. Why is output gain second? Doesn't make any sense, but that's okay. Not all things do. I love this compressor. You can love it too. I would also point out, by the way, that if you are wanting to test out sounds of different compressors, third-party ones in particular, everybody knows I'm a huge Waves fan. This is one here, Valley People Dynamite by Softtube. They're a Swedish company. I love their plugins. I actually have the analog version of this. Not only does it sound identical, different compressors sound different. This one is known for, it's very good on drums, very good on bass. It's very fast. This is the other thing. Don't be fooled by that attack release. Sometimes the compressors, they don't, because of the way that they're modeled, they're not quite as fast. They don't quite give you the snap or the punch or the boom that you're looking for. They all work differently. They sound differently. There's opto compressors. There's again, tube-based, all different types of things. So they all have a different sound, a different characteristic. Lots of third-party ones out there. Again, a couple of my favorites, just to show you here real quickly, Waves. We talked about like LA2A and the classic Yuri 1176. This is one here that was made famous at Abbey Road with the Beatles. So great. So many favorites in here. What else? C6 is pretty good. DBX 160. I've used this one on stream before. It's a classic DBX 160A. It has something called soft knee compression. It's great on everything. Oh, and then this one is supposed to be an emulation of the Fairchild 660 and 670, which was also used on a lot of Abbey Road recordings in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so that is audio compression for dialogue, music, and whatever. Now you know how to set it manually. Want to point out again that if you're not quite as adventurous just yet, you can always go into Essential Sound, right? Tag your media as dialogue, music, sound effects, or ambience, and then we have a control in there called Clarity, which here, if I just did this and selected dialogue, Clarity and Dynamics, now you have one slider to adjust compression. So basically, it's going to do all the work for you. Everything that we just set manually, this will do with one slider, and you don't have to think about it. And it does a very, very good job. And you can see that it's kind of telling you what it's doing. It's going from a more natural sound with minimal dynamics processing to a more focused, upfront kind of sound. This also uses a bit of our Sensei technology by auto-detecting those threshold levels. Threshold is the hardest thing to set, by the way, especially if you have dialogue that's all over the place. You might think, I don't know if I'm setting it correctly. Well, that's why you have to look and listen and watch that gain reduction meter. You'll get it. You might have to watch this a few times to see through, but try it first with something like drums. Don't try it on, your favorite music track that's already been mixed and mastered. You're not going to hear anything. Try it, go and find a free drum loop or a beat or something, and really you'll understand how they use it in mixing, and then you can apply that same knowledge to dialogue. All right? Let's bounce over to the chat and see if we have any comments coming through. English Trainer, you are very welcome. Hello. Blake of the Brown, hello. Unonu, nice to see you. Artist Sound, hello. Hey Desiree, CJ Martin. All right. Pounding Hooves, nice to see you as well. Hold on, let me switch back to my screen here. It doesn't look like we have a lot of questions on the scope. Let's check over here on YouTube. All right. Sven from Germany. Kishan, how are you? Tariq, this is the most important topic for music video editors. Excellent explanation. Thank you so much. You are very welcome. Glad you enjoyed it. All right, Remy Duff, hello. So Tariq, you can find on YouTube where you are watching this, go to Audio 101, and I have already several episodes on compression, mixing, mastering, and equalization for music video. So you can check that out on there. Woot844, do you ever use multiband compressor for voices? You know, you absolutely can, but honestly, I mean, I'm saying this, again, personal opinion, but coming out of engineering for 30 plus years, audio engineering, it's a little overkill. And here's why. Multiband compression allows you to set a compressor for different bands, different frequency bands on your signal. Now, while voices can be fairly complex, mine, case in point, I have a lot of low end warmth and resonance. So there's a lot of bass in there. At the same time, I also have a pretty good peak and clarity between 5 and 8K. So if I wanted to tame my bass frequencies with a different compression ratio than my mids and highs, that's what a multiband compressor is for. The thing is, you don't really do that for spoken word. You don't do that for dialogue. You can. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's overkill. If your voice is too bassy, use equalization, use an EQ to attenuate or remove some of that bass before you compress it. All right? Ultimately, the effect of compressing across multiple bands for a voice, unless the voice is really oddly recorded, let's not even say poorly recorded, it's probably more than you need. A single band compressor should be able to do what that vocal requires, okay? And again, it may require a little bit of EQ before the compressor. I get this asked all the time. EQ before the compressor or after? It's not an absolute. Sometimes, generally, you EQ before compression. Sometimes you EQ before compression and then EQ a little after. Sometimes it's clean and lovely. You compress first and then maybe you EQ after the compressor to take a little bit of that compressed edge off. It just really matters. It's just really important to listen, okay? Giant of the North, is there not a huge difference between the single band and the tube compressor? So the reason I didn't show the single band, and here, that's a great question, I'll pop it back into the chat, is because the single band compressor doesn't have any gain reduction metering. So it's impossible to illustrate what's happening. Note, as I mentioned, promised you, threshold, ratio, attack, release, album. Oh, by the way, look, they're in the correct order here. Are you listening, audition team? We need to fix that. They need to be consistent. The way it is in the tube modeled makes no sense. This makes sense. However, the reason why I never use this one, there's no metering in here. So, yes, if you have excellent ears, you can listen for it entirely. I like to think my ears are good. I still use gain reduction metering because that's how you really know exactly what's happening. It's not even that you have to verify. You can hear it once you know what to listen for. But it helps you really carefully curtail that compression. So that's it. Sonically, I want to say they're pretty darn similar. I think that single band may also use the same tube modeled algorithm. I'm not entirely sure, but hopefully that answers your question, Giant of the North. All right. Okay, Daniel Chaplin, do you have any suggestions for compression when you're doing a live stream? Do you mean just sort of compressing a voiceover? I mean, same kind of thing, you know, for podcast, VO. If you're going to put a compressor either in your streaming software, like Wirecast allows me to add VST effects in the chain before I go out as it's broadcasting. Same thing applies, you know. I would use a fairly not aggressive ratio, something below 4:1. You know, unless you're like a super crazy dynamic speaker, which we used to do Twitch. You know, a lot of people on Twitch are like, yeah, quiet ASMR, yeah, like all this craziness. You want a higher ratio for something like that. So the same sort of technique applies. But yes, totally legit. A lot of people do it. A lot of people actually can even do it if you go through our software. You can set up a live input through Adobe Audition and use effects in there to monitor your voice and to send it out through OBS or Wirecast, compressed or denoised or whatever you like. All right. Peter Whiter, thank you so much. All right. CT, how are you doing? Great to see you. Thank you, IF Performance Circle. Okay. David Lewis. Okay, so if I record a live show to a podcast, is it a single file with my speech and music? I use amplitude stats to get the threshold. Then I set the tube model compressor. Good idea. Okay, so yes, that all works. If you already have a combined, I mean, again, now if we're talking about compressing where you already have dialogue and music mixed together, it's a little different only in the sense that, I mean, unless the music is never moves, you know, if you're riding the faders of music, how you set that compressor, it's going to be very different. Like that's not a great practice. You're making it harder for yourself. You can still control dynamics, but remember, if you're riding the fader of music to where it's louder and then it sort of fades off as the dialogue comes in, well, if you've got a compressor applied to that, chances are that music's going to kick the compressor in, and, you know, if the attack release aren't set correctly or the thresholds, you know, the music is likely has more loudness components than a single voice, it's probably not going to sound great. So ideally you want to compress those separately. And then as a final mastering stage, yes, you do compress and limit after the fact. So yes, David, you can do that. If they're not compressed ahead of time though, and they're already mixed together, it's just making it a little bit harder for yourself, okay? Shamir Ali, you're very welcome. Daniel Chapman, didn't know that about Wirecast. Yes. Oh yeah, it's great. And their native effects they're pretty good. I got to say, they're pretty good. All right. Let's go over to Facebook. Max Bard. Okay, hold on. I'll switch back here for just a moment so you can see my face. All right. Hey, Sandy Chu. Philip Seitz. Great to see you too. All right. Ashir Bon, hello. Mohan, all right. Michelle from New Haven, great to see you. Pedro Wells, all right. Lars from Denmark, all right. Hey, Thomas, great to see you. You're at a rest stop enjoying this, super. Peter Gondway, I really appreciate that. From Zambia, oh, very nice. Marco Dongo, all right. Eric from the rainy Netherlands. Sandy Chu, your audio challenge, you don't hear any difference. Okay, now again, if you're on like just computer speakers or whatever, listen to it back in headphones, okay? I probably could have gone even more extreme just so that it's really obvious. This is why I said, Sandy, you are not alone, okay? If you don't know what you're listening for, and this is why the metering helps you, right? It's very easy to overdo or underdo it, or do nothing, right? You set a compressor, you like throw a preset on there, like it's compressed, but like nothing changes. That's 95% of people, unless they understand how compression works. So give it a shot, listen, use the techniques that I showed you. If you drop that threshold, instead of minus 29, you know, go extreme, go minus 40, and use a ratio of anything at that point, 2 to 1, 3 to 1, you're going to start to hear things being squashed down. And then if you add that makeup gain, you're going to hear it start to be pushed forward. And if you adjust that attack time, you'll hear it go from very, very squashed to letting a bit more of that dynamic range pump through. You just have to, you know, you have to train your ear and train your brain to know what to listen for, to know if it even sounds good. So fear not. It just takes a little bit of practice. All right. All right, Javier. Okay, I have those issues of the quiet to loud audio when I edit our church's messages. It's rough because our pastor whispers at times. He's got a headset mic. Yeah, could really use some help on that. So yeah, Javier, now this is an example. If you've got extreme dynamic range or extreme dynamic changes, remember, you can still use a less aggressive ratio, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, but that means you're going to want to drop that threshold even more so that it is compressing the quieter sounds. The sort of reverse of that is if you just want to really amplify everything and kill the peaks but amplify the soft spots, that's really where you want to use limiting, right? So if it's really extreme, beyond about 10 decibels, using the compressor as a limiter is probably going to be better for you. All right, that's probably really where you want to go. And again, that's just using a ratio above 10 to 1. Glenn Locke, you are very welcome. Thank you. Thomas, thank you so much for enjoying the clearly explained various settings. Thank you. Actually, I got some nice comments about that the other day. Anybody who watches me knows, yes, you get enormous amounts of detailed descriptions. It's just the way I roll. So I appreciate that. Often to the effect of me running well over time in the streams, but that's how it goes. Okay, sometime Michelle's asking, could you explain the mastering choices under special and the effects panel? How does this interact with compression and EQ effects? Okay. All right. Okay, Michelle, I'm going to take that question, then I'll do probably two more, and then we're going to have to go. Let's go back to the desktop, and I'll just explain that real quickly, because that one is related to compression, and it's worth pointing out. So I mentioned before, just talking to David about, if you've already got your dialogue and music and effects and everything mixed together, yes, it is always a part of the final delivery to add compression limiting, brick wall limiting to the end stage. This would be known as kind of part of the mastering process. Now, under special, we have this mastering effect. And Michelle, I'm bringing this up because I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not a fan of this. Okay? Now, what's cool about it is that it has a basic 3-band equalizer. All right. Then it has the ability to add some spatial ambient reverb. This isn't like hall reverb. This is just to give things a little bit more ambience, a little bit more space. An aural exciter. This is an effect from back in the day. Frankly, it doesn't translate well to digital. I don't recommend using that. Personal choice. Do what you want. I don't recommend using it. Stereo widener. Obvious there. Now we have a separate stereo width effect, which I would probably use before this. Loudness maximizer. That is a brick wall styled limiter. And then an output gain control. Here's the thing about this mastering effect, which is sort of a combination of limiting, EQ, and exciting. It's bright. It's an algorithm. We've had this for a while. It's not warm. Not to say you can't get a decent result with it. I mean, there is an equalizer in there, so you can tame and take some of the edge off. It just, in general, especially with the exciter and the widener together and that maximizer, they just don't do it for me. All right, even this like default preset is bright hype. It's bright, so bright. I don't recommend this. If you like having kind of everything all in one space, give it a go. I tend, every time I've ever used it, it just makes things a little more brittle sounding than they actually are. And it just has to do with, like I said before, all compressors, they all sound different. So if you like this, if you like that kind of single slider thing, frankly, I would use Essential Sound and use Clarity for your compression and use some of the EQ presets, again, with the sliders. And then you can always go into the effects controls, which will reveal the actual graphic equalizers that are used as part of Essential Sound. And then you have individual tweaking that you can do. This one here, really, I mean, I always say use what you like, but it's bright, all right? It's a little bright. That DBX 160 from Waves, again, I've got the analog one right there, fat and warm. You like it fat? That's what that is. Fat, never bright. That's the sound of that compressor from the early 70s. This mastering one, so bright. So bright. Makes me think of late 90s, early 2000s boy bands, like just this bright, poppy, a lot of sibilance. It's not my favorite. Okay. All right. Hugo Vega. Yes, the clarity option in Essential Sound is also available in Audition. Yes, so you have the same things that you can use there. Yuri, hello, you're so kind, thank you. David Ham, all right, sweet. Adrian, thank you. Mark Cruz. You need to go into nature and do some reflection. Yes. Stan Arthur, what's up, dude? Michelle, oh, you're very kind. Thank you. All right. Last ones. I got to go. Henry Cormy. Okay. If I want to create a trailer, what would you recommend compressing? Sound effects and how to duck the music when there was too much dialogue. Ducking every now and then might be very annoying for the viewer. Yeah. So, again, if you've got the trailer, before you mix everything, you definitely want to compress the voices, all dialogue. By the way, it's often that you will compress just to fix peaks of dialogue, just the peaks, again, so you don't want to amplify it necessarily. And then subgroup, I just did a stream on this a couple weeks ago in Premiere, submix all the dialogue to a stereo or mono master, and then apply another compressor to all the dialogue. So first you tame the dynamics of each individual speaker, all right, mix them with the faders accordingly, and then bus them to another fader so that you can compress everything all together at once. You would use a post-fader send for that, by the way. I discuss it in, again, a previous stream. You can watch it on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, Periscope. And then that's going to just allow all the dialogue to be pushed forward at the same rate, at the same level, with the same setting. It's not going to fail you. And then as for ducking, again, you can use Essential Sound for that. You could use Essential Sound for all the dialogue mixing. And if you use the auto match control in Essential Sound, that will take the average listening level of all of your random dialogue and make it all the same. So it's kind of doing what individually compressing each track would do automatically, which is great. All right. Pause, le don. Can I speak French? Un peu. I studied it for 7 years. I used to be fluent, and then I just stopped using it because of where I was. So I can, if I get really into it, I can start doing it. When we used to tour France, I would often do intros and things en français, but not too much. A post Darth Vader send, Gilded Shab says. Okay, very good. All right, just checking here to see any more. Blake of the Brown. Oh, thank you very much for that. All right, English trainer. Okay, well, that's it, friends. Okay, so thank you so much for watching. Again, you'll be able to watch the replay on Facebook, on Twitter, Periscope, on YouTube. So until tomorrow, I'll be on the After Effects Facebook channels and, of course, Periscope and YouTube, talking about, I think I'm going to do a little thing on some little hidden things in After Effects that you're probably not aware of. So we're going to cover some of that. Hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.